She ruled Russia not with whispers, not with mere decrees, but with a weapon older than any army: desire. Catherine the Great, Empress of the vast Russian Empire, understood that power was not only in armies or treaties, it was in the bodies and minds of men. She used sex like a general uses artillery, precise, ruthless, and devastating. Born as Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German princess, she arrived in St. Petersburg at 17, naive, fragile, and completely underestimated. Everyone expected her to be a mere wife, a ceremonial figurehead for Peter III, a man child obsessed with toys and artillery. But Sophie had ambition in her bones, a hunger that would not be tamed. Within months, she transformed herself, adopting the name Catherine, embracing the Russian Orthodox Church, and masking innocence with a calculating charm that would soon become lethal. It began subtly. Courtiers, generals, ministers, men with influence, men who believed themselves untouchable, found themselves entranced. They underestimated her not because she was weak, but because they assumed a woman could never wield real power. Catherine used their assumptions against them. A smile here, a flirtatious glance there, and suddenly the fate of entire armies, of entire regions, could shift according to her whim. Sex, for Catherine, was not indulgence, it was strategy. Lovers were not lovers, they were instruments, each one carefully chosen for influence, loyalty, or convenience. Grigory Orlov, for example, began as a charming, daring officer, a man of boldness and ambition. But Catherine saw in him a tool, a way to manipulate the court, to bend the military to her will, to create factions that would secure her assent. Their encounters were private, intimate, but always calculated. Each kiss, each embrace, reinforced a network of control, and soon Peter III was isolated, ridiculed, powerless in his own court. By the time the coup against Peter took place, Catherine's mastery of desire had already written the map of victory. She didn't storm the palace with troops alone. She had won the loyalty of key generals, seduced and controlled the men whose support would decide her fate. And when Peter was deposed, humiliated, and removed, she did not rejoice openly. Instead, she methodically assumed power, a queen crowned not by chance, but by cunning seduction turned into an art form. Her relationships never lasted merely for pleasure. They were meticulously timed, calculated. Each man she allowed close was evaluated, tested, and eventually discarded when he no longer served her purpose. Alexander Vassilchikov, Stanislav Poniatowski, Grigory Potemkin, each became part of a larger strategy. Potemkin, the most enduring, was both lover and political ally, his influence inseparable from hers. Together, they expanded Russia's borders, modernized the empire, and cemented her authority, but always under her terms. She held the reins, and he, no matter how powerful, was always aware of the limits of his own influence. Yet Catherine's weapon was double-edged. The court whispered of her promiscuity, of her appetite, but Catherine turned scandal into power. Men feared losing her favor more than they feared disgrace. To be in her bed was to hold a key. To be denied was a humiliation that could destroy reputations overnight. She manipulated desires, turned intimacy into leverage, and transformed lust into law. She proved that the throne could be secured not only through fear or war, but through the subtle, devastating control of hearts and bodies. But behind the calculated glances, the seductions, there was a loneliness few could perceive. Catherine's use of sex as a weapon isolated her in ways the crown alone could not. Friends became tools. Lovers became pawns. The very acts she used to gain power were also the acts that ensured no one truly belonged to her. She ruled an empire, yet her nights were hers alone, filled with strategy, reflection, and the occasional fleeting pleasure that never dared become genuine intimacy. Still, the results were undeniable. Under her reign, Russia expanded its borders to the Black Sea, secured Crimea, and became a recognized European power. The court feared her. Foreign diplomats courted her, and every major player in Europe understood that Catherine the Great's authority could not be challenged, not because of armies or alliances, but because of her intelligence, her ruthlessness, and the lethal precision of her personal charms. She weaponized what men valued most and demonstrated that desire, when controlled by the cunning, was more formidable than any sword. There were those who envied her, who despised her, who whispered in dark corners about the dangers of a woman who turned her sexuality into a political instrument. Yet Catherine ignored them all, focusing instead on the empire she would rule with unmatched brilliance. Every lover she took, every courtier she manipulated, every political move she orchestrated, was part of a grand design, not for pleasure, not for love, but for absolute, unassailable power. Catherine the Great died as she had lived, revered, feared, and entirely in control. Her bedchambers were legendary, her conquests whispered in scandal sheets, yet historians now understand the method behind the myth. She used sex as a weapon not for indulgence, but as armor and sword combined. Where armies failed, desire succeeded. Where diplomacy faltered, seduction commanded. She proved that the ultimate power is often wielded in ways invisible to those who assume only men hold the keys to kingdoms. The empire she left behind was vast, powerful, and enduring. And her personal legacy, a queen who weaponized intimacy, remains a lesson in the unspoken rules of power, that control is not always held in legislation or in armies, but in the mind, the heart, and the burning desire of those who would serve you. Catherine the Great turned sex into strategy, passion into policy, and desire into dominion. And in doing so, she wrote herself into history, not just as a monarch, but as a master of the human will, the ultimate manipulator in an empire ruled as much by hearts as by laws. Catherine's manipulation of desire was not limited to the bedroom. Every whispered secret, every private tryst, became a thread in a web she spun across the Russian Empire. Courtiers never knew whether they were being seduced for pleasure or for control, and that uncertainty was her greatest weapon. Men who believed themselves irresistible often found themselves in positions they could never have imagined. Generals loyal not to the crown, but to her personal favor. Ministers making decisions they thought were autonomous, when in fact each was guided by her subtle hand. Grigory Orlov had been the first, the proof of concept. He was reckless, young, and daring, a man who thrived on attention and prestige. Catherine recognized immediately that his ambition could be harnessed. Their encounters were electric, charged not merely with lust, but with mutual calculation. Orlov's loyalty was absolute, forged in the fires of desire she carefully fanned. Through him, she gained influence over the palace guard, the officers, even the whispers that reached her husband's ears. Peter III, oblivious and indulgent in his own childish obsessions, never saw the trap closing around him. It was not always immediate. Catherine had patience. She knew that power, like a fine blade, needed time to sharpen. Each man she drew close had to be tested, observed, and measured. Alexander Vassilchikov was allowed entry into her bed, but only after she gauged his temperament, his loyalty, and his ambition. Even intimacy was a tool of assessment, a private interrogation disguised as pleasure. Those who failed her tests were discarded quietly. Those who succeeded were kept close, sometimes indefinitely, but always under her strict surveillance. The court was a minefield, but Catherine navigated it with terrifying precision. Factions formed, and she used desire to manipulate them, turning rivalries into opportunities. She played her lovers against each other, exploiting envy and lust alike. A man desperate for her favor would betray allies, reveal secrets, or commit acts he would never have contemplated on his own. And all of it, every betrayal, every concession, every secret, flowed into Catherine's hands like water into a reservoir. Her power was measured not in cannon fire or borders conquered, but in whispered admissions, in furtive glances, in the trembling loyalty of men who believed they controlled her, when in truth she controlled them. Potemkin was the apex of this strategy. Unlike Orlov or Vasilchikov, he was more than a lover. He was a partner, a mirror reflecting her ambition, amplifying it, yet never rivaling it. He adored her, and she let him, but never without boundaries. Potemkin's military campaigns, his political maneuvers, even his personal glory, all became extensions of her will. Together, they conquered territories, reformed administrations, and modernized an empire. But every victory carried the silent, invisible stamp of Catherine's dominance. The intimacy she shared with him was a currency as valuable as gold, as binding as any treaty, and she spent it sparingly, wisely, strategically. Yet there was danger in wielding sex as a weapon. Men who believed themselves indispensable often underestimated her. Orlov, after years of devotion, eventually sought to assert more influence than Catherine permitted. He discovered in time that her affection was conditional, her loyalty unflinching only to the extent that it served her goals. Even Potemkin, for all his devotion, could never fully claim her autonomy. Catherine's love was never unconditional. It was always intertwined with strategy, with the quiet assertion that she alone controlled the game. The psychological impact of her method cannot be overstated. Men feared her not merely because of her intellect, but because they understood that intimacy with Catherine carried consequences far beyond pleasure. To be in her favor was a boon. To fall out of it could mean ruin, disgrace, or social annihilation. Ambition, desire, lust, all became tools she wielded to bend the most powerful men in Russia to her will. She weaponized not just their bodies, but their psyches, creating a court where fear and longing intertwined so tightly that no one could act without her knowledge or influence. Even foreign dignitaries learned her methods, sometimes too late. Ambassadors were invited to private dinners, their flattery rewarded with smiles that suggested more than mere politeness. Catherine gauged their ambition, their moral flexibility, their willingness to compromise. Those who succumbed to her charms often returned home carrying favors or concessions that advanced Russian interests. Diplomacy, she demonstrated, need not always rely on treaties or threats. It could be conducted through desire, subtle suggestion, and calculated intimacy. Behind the scenes, her personal sacrifices were immense. Catherine understood that using sex as a weapon required distance from genuine attachment. Trust, in its purest form, was a luxury she could not afford. Every relationship carried risk, the risk of attachment, the risk of exposure, the risk that a man might discover her manipulations and retaliate. She balanced every encounter with meticulous care, ensuring that her vulnerability was never exposed, that desire was always a controlled variable in the equation of power. The court whispered endlessly. Catherine's appetites, her affairs, her lovers. Each story was exaggerated, distorted, and repeated. Yet she turned gossip into armor. Those who judged her publicly were often those most vulnerable to her private influence. She demonstrated that perception could be weaponized as effectively as intimacy. A scandal whispered in corridors could intimidate, distract, and divide, allowing her to operate above suspicion, unseen and untouchable. Even in her later years, Catherine maintained the precision of her strategy. Lovers were selected for political convenience, for intelligence, for their ability to advance her agenda. Some were dismissed after brief liaisons, leaving them humiliated, eager to retain her favor for fear of public disgrace. Others, like Potemkin, remained close, their devotion secured not only through passion, but through recognition of her strategic brilliance. Catherine's mastery of desire became synonymous with mastery of the empire itself. She proved, through decades of governance, that sex could indeed be weaponized on a scale as grand as any army or navy. By the end of her reign, Catherine the Great had achieved a feat few rulers ever accomplish: absolute dominance over her court, unchallenged authority over her empire, and an enduring legacy that extended far beyond politics. Her relationships, her lovers, her manipulations, all were part of a coherent strategy that allowed her to command respect, fear, and awe. She demonstrated that power was never merely inherited or seized. It could be crafted, shaped, and enforced with subtlety, intelligence, and the carefully calibrated use of human desire. And so she ruled, a queen whose power was absolute, whose intellect unmatched, and whose understanding of the human heart proved as decisive as any battlefield victory. Catherine's weapon, the calculated use of intimacy, was invisible, yet invincible. She taught Russia and the world that true control lies not in domination alone, but in mastery of the human will, in the quiet, devastating command of hearts and minds, where even the most powerful men found themselves helpless to resist. By the time Catherine reached her later years, the empire she had shaped was unrecognizable from the Russia she had inherited. Vast, disciplined, and feared across Europe, it bore the unmistakable imprint of her mind, her ambition, and, above all, her unparalleled manipulation of human desire. Yet even as her power grew, so did the shadows cast by the weapon she wielded so mercilessly. Intimacy turned into strategy, pleasure transformed into leverage, desire harnessed for dominion. Her court had become a labyrinth of loyalty and fear, each relationship a careful calculation, every whisper a potential threat or advantage. Ministers, generals, ambassadors, all danced to her tune, aware that a glance, a touch, a private word could shift the balance of their careers, even their lives. Catherine had perfected an art few could recognize, much less resist: the ability to bend the most powerful men to her will while maintaining the appearance of casual indulgence. Potemkin remained her closest ally, her longest-lasting lover, and her most trusted collaborator. But even he understood the limits of his influence. Catherine wielded power over him not through coercion, but through an intricate blend of admiration, desire, and the constant reminder that her autonomy was absolute. She allowed him victories, applauded his ambitions, yet never let him forget that ultimate authority resided in her alone. Their love was real, but it was entwined with strategy, and even Potemkin, brilliant as he was a player in a game he could never fully control. The other lovers, once numerous and strategically chosen, had all but vanished from the corridors of her palace. They had served their purpose, been discarded or quietly pushed aside. Some harbored resentment, some shame, yet all were ensnared in the invisible web she had spun. Catherine understood that intimacy, when weaponized, had a shelf life. Desire was powerful, but fleeting, and she alone must endure the cost of wielding it so ruthlessly. Nights spent in calculated pleasure, hours devoted to assessing the loyalty of others, and decades of maintaining the illusion of indulgence left her isolated, a sovereign queen surrounded by admiration and fear, but deprived of true companionship. The political victories she achieved through her methods were extraordinary. Crimea was secured, borders expanded, and Russia became a recognized European superpower. Her reforms modernized the administration, strengthened the military, and cultivated the arts and sciences. Yet behind every triumph lay the subtle shadow of her personal manipulations. Ministers who enacted reforms did so not only out of duty or vision, but because she had carefully ensured their allegiance through a combination of desire, fear, and ambition. Generals who won battles did so knowing that her favor or her withdrawal of it could determine their fortunes. And there were betrayals, inevitable in a court so tightly controlled by intimacy and fear. Some men attempted to leverage their closeness for power beyond what she would permit. Orlov, embittered by rejection, tried to regain influence through scheming, only to be outmaneuvered at every turn. Others underestimated her ruthlessness, believing that affection implied leniency. Catherine crushed such illusions with a cold efficiency, reminding all who remained that she was not a ruler to be outwitted, only obeyed. Even her enemies in foreign courts learned the consequences of misjudging her. Diplomats who assumed her charm was weakness found themselves conceding treaties, advancing Russian interests, and adjusting policies in ways that benefited her empire. Catherine's genius was that her weapon, the calculated use of intimacy, was invisible to those who fell prey to it. Desire, envy, admiration, and fear became the silent armies she commanded, and through them she achieved conquest that might have required decades of conventional warfare. But the cost of wielding such power was not merely personal, it was deeply psychological. Catherine lived with the constant awareness that her authority rested on fragile human threads. Desire could wane, loyalty could falter, and scandal could erupt at any moment. She mitigated these risks with vigilance, with charm, with the meticulous orchestration of her court. Every private encounter was carefully monitored, every alliance subtly reinforced, and every rival subtly undermined. She understood that power gained through intimacy was potent but fragile, requiring endless attention, endless calculation, and a mind sharper than any blade. In the quiet of her private chambers, Catherine sometimes reflected on the paradox of her reign. She had conquered more than armies, more than territories, more than political rivals. She had conquered desire itself, bending it to her will. Yet in doing so, she had also created a solitude few could understand. Her lovers, her allies, her most trusted friends, all were instruments, their affections measured and utilized. The intimacy that could have brought comfort instead became another tool of strategy, leaving her both invincible and profoundly alone. Despite this, she remained unyielding. Catherine did not falter, did not waver, did not allow sentiment to weaken her hand. The empire depended on her strength, and she had learned that strength demanded sacrifice. Personal satisfaction was subordinate to political survival. Genuine intimacy was subordinate to influence. Love was subordinate to power. she had discovered and embraced the harshest truth of rulership. Desire could be commanded, and in commanding it, she could command the empire itself. Her legacy was, therefore, twofold. She was remembered as a visionary, a ruler whose reforms and conquests shaped the trajectory of Russian history. And she was remembered as a master of human psychology, a woman who weaponized the most intimate of human experiences to secure unassailable authority. Historians debate her morality, her indulgences, her methods, but none question her effectiveness. Catherine's reign was proof that power was not solely exercised through armies or legislation, but through the deliberate, calculated manipulation of desire. By the end, Catherine had achieved something almost unparalleled in history. She commanded fear, loyalty, admiration, and lust with equal skill. She turned intimacy into influence, seduction into strategy, and desire into dominion. Men who believed themselves masters were, in truth, her instruments. Women who sought to challenge her found doors closed, reputations tarnished, and ambitions redirected. The empire was hers in every sense, secured not merely by law or sword, but by the intricate, invisible web of human hearts and minds she had spun. When Catherine the Great finally passed, she left behind more than territories and reforms. She left behind a blueprint for power, ruthless, psychological, and profoundly intimate. She demonstrated that mastery over human desire could be as decisive as mastery over armies. She showed that intimacy, when weaponized, could bend not just individuals but entire nations to one's will. And she proved, above all, that a queen who understands the human heart, its fears, its desires, its vulnerabilities, can wield authority more absolute, more enduring, and more terrifying than any monarch before or after her. Catherine the Great's reign ended not in scandal, not in disgrace, not in defeat, but in absolute, calculated triumph. The empire was hers. History remembers her, and the subtle, devastating power she wielded, the weapon of desire sharpened into strategy, remains an unmatched testament to her genius. She ruled not only with intellect, with courage, or with armies, but with the most enduring, elusive force in human history, the mind, the body, and the will of those who believed they could resist her and could not.